Kamsiyochukwu Duru had everything a man could want, and none of what he needed. He was the sole heir to the Duru Group, a private hospital and real estate empire that stretched from Lagos to Abuja, and yet every woman who had ever whispered, "I love you," into his ear had done so with one eye on his bank balance. He had been engaged twice, and both times he discovered, quite by accident, that the women in question had been counting his properties before they had learned his birthday. His father, Chief Prince Duru, laughed it off as the price of wealth, but Kamsi could not laugh. He remembered the exact moment something in him hardened, standing outside a boardroom, overhearing his last fiancée tell her sister on the phone that she could finally stop pretending to enjoy his company. Once the wedding contracts were signed, that night he made a decision that would change everything. If no one could love him without his money, then he would remove the money from the equation entirely, even if it meant becoming someone the world would look straight past. He would become invisible, disabled, poor, and see who, if anyone, would still choose to kneel beside him. He did not tell his parents where he was going. He simply vanished from Lagos for 6 weeks, telling only his personal driver, Ifani, who dropped him 3 states away with nothing but a wheelchair, worn clothes, and a fabricated accident story about a spinal injury from a motorcycle crash. He chose Grace Community Hospital deliberately, a chronically underfunded charity ward known for treating patients who could not pay, the kind of hospital his own family's glittering private chain would never be caught associating with. If he wanted proof that kindness still existed without a price tag, this was where he would find it, or he would find nothing at all, and confirm what he already feared, that in this world, love always came with an invoice. Zuriel Ahmadi had been a nurse at Grace Community Hospital for 4 years, and she still could not walk into the building without feeling the weight of everything riding on her shoulders. Her pink scrubs were faded from 100 washes, her ponytail always slightly undone by the 3rd hour of her shift, but her hands never once trembled when a patient needed her. She worked triple shifts most weeks, not because the hospital demanded it, but because her mother's kidneys were failing, and dialysis 3 times a week was bleeding her salary dry faster than she could earn it. She had learned to survive on 4 hours of sleep and the quiet promise she made to herself every single morning, that no matter how tired she was, no patient under her care would ever feel like a burden, because she knew exactly what it felt like to be treated like one. When the new indigent patient was wheeled into Ward 4, a young man with haunted eyes and a chart that simply read, "Tund, spinal trauma, unable to pay," she did not see a stranger. She saw someone the system had already begun to give up on, and something inside her refused to let that happen twice in one lifetime. "You don't have to keep checking on me every hour," Tund said quietly on his 3rd night, watching her adjust his 4-line with a gentleness the other nurses reserved only for patients who could pay their bills. "I've seen how the administrator looks at me. I know what happens to men like me here." Zuriel did not look up from what she was doing. "Then you've been watching the wrong nurse," she said. "Because as long as I am on this ward, nobody gets forgotten in a bed because they're poor. I don't care what it says on your chart." He studied her face for a long moment, searching for the calculation he had learned to expect from every woman who had ever been kind to him, the flicker of interest that arrived the instant they discovered who he really was. It never came, because she did not know who he really was. Later that week, when the hospital administrator, Mr. Bassi, tried to move Tund to a lower priority list to free the bed for a paying patient, Zuriel stood in his office and refused to let the transfer form be signed, offering to personally track his vitals on her own unpaid time if it meant he stayed. Kamsi, listening from the corridor in his wheelchair, felt something crack open in his chest that he had spent years sealing shut, the terrifying, humbling sensation of being fought for by someone who had nothing to gain from the fight. By the 2nd week, Zuriel had begun paying for Tund's medication out of her own pocket, quietly, without telling him, slipping receipts into a drawer she never opened in front of anyone. Her colleague, Nurse Uzo Bello, noticed the pattern of missing petty cash and the extra hours Zuriel spent at Tund's bedside, and made no attempt to hide her disapproval. "You're falling for a man who has nothing, Zuriel, while you can barely afford your own mother's dialysis," Uzo snapped one afternoon in the break room. Some of us have to be practical. Dr. Chikobara, the senior physician who had quietly admired Zuriel since her first day at Grace Community, overheard the exchange and later found a moment alone with her. I'm not trying to interfere, he said carefully. But you give so much of yourself to everyone else. Who takes care of you, Zuriel? She smiled the tired smile she always gave when a question got too close to the truth, and changed the subject. That night, sitting beside Tun's bed long after visiting hours had ended, she made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. She would find a way to raise money for the surgery his chart claimed he desperately needed, even if it meant sacrificing something she had sworn she would never give up. The wedding ring that had belonged to her late father, the only inheritance she had left of him. If this story is speaking to your heart already, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive. Chapter 2 is coming up, and it gets even more emotional. Zuriel stood outside the small pawn shop on Allen Avenue for almost 10 minutes before she found the courage to walk in, her father's ring wrapped in a handkerchief inside her palm like something alive that she was about to lose forever. Her father had died when she was 19, and the ring, a thin gold band with a single, modest stone, was the last physical thing that connected her to his voice, his laugh, the way he used to call her NWAM, his child, even when she was fully grown. She had refused to sell it during the worst of her mother's medical bills, refused when the landlord threatened eviction, refused even when she had gone 2 days without eating so her mother could have enough for transportation to the dialysis center. But watching Tun's eyes each morning, the quiet way he thanked her as though gratitude cost him something he could barely afford, had unlocked a tenderness in her she did not know how to contain. She told herself it was simply what any decent nurse would do for a patient in need. She did not yet have the vocabulary for what she actually felt, because admitting it meant admitting she had fallen in love with a man the hospital records listed as penniless, disabled, and utterly without a future, and admitting that terrified her more than the sale itself. She walked out of the shop with a fraction of what she needed, but it was a start, and starts were all she had ever been given in life. That evening, she sat beside Tun's bed and told him, gently, that she had begun raising funds for his surgery, careful not to reveal exactly how. He went pale in a way that had nothing to do with his fabricated injury. Zuriel, you don't need to do this, he said, his voice cracking in a way he could not fully explain to himself. I mean it. Please, don't sacrifice anything for me. She simply took his hand, the way she had 100 times before, except this time neither of them let go right away. You've been treated like you don't matter your whole life in this hospital's eyes, she said softly. I refuse to be one more person who looks at you and sees a burden instead of a human being. Whatever it costs me, it's worth it if it means you walk again. In that moment, Kamsi understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he was no longer conducting an experiment. He had gone looking for proof that love without money existed, and he had found something far more dangerous, a woman he could not bear to keep lying to, and a truth he now knew would destroy everything the second he confessed it. That night, for the first time since he arrived at Grace Community, he lay awake calculating not his father's business empire, but the exact words he would need to explain 6 weeks of deception to a woman who had just sold her father's memory to save him. Uzoamako watched the growing closeness between Zuriel and the mysterious patient in Ward 4 with an irritation that curdled quickly into obsession. She had noticed something the others hadn't, the quality of Tun's diction when he forgot to soften it, the expensive watch tan line on his wrist that no truly poor man would carry, the way he sometimes caught himself mid-sentence as though correcting an accent he wasn't used to hiding. She began finding reasons to linger near his bed when Zuriel was on break, testing him with pointed questions, complimenting his strong jawline for a man who's been through so much, positioning herself as available in every way Zuriel currently wasn't. You know, Yuzo said one evening, adjusting his blanket unnecessarily, not every woman here is drowning in family problems and hospital debt. Some of us would know exactly how to take care of a man like you, once you're back on your feet. Kamsi, uncomfortable, kept his answers short and his eyes on the door, but Yuzo was patient, and patience, she had decided, would eventually pay off, especially once she confirmed the suspicion growing inside her that Tund was not who his hospital chart claimed him to be. Her suspicion was confirmed faster than she expected. A senior consultant visiting from a private Lagos clinic for a conference happened to pass through Grace Community's charity ward and froze mid-step at the sight of the young man in Ward 4. "Sir? Mr. Duru?" the consultant said, loud enough for 3 nearby beds to hear. "Kamsiyochukwu Duru, is that truly you? Your father has had private investigators searching every state for you for weeks. We assumed the worst." The ward went silent except for the beeping of monitors. Zuriel, walking in at that exact moment with a fresh 4 bag in her hands, stopped in the doorway as the words rearranged themselves in her mind, refusing at first to make sense. Duru. Kamsiyochukwu Duru. The Duru Group. The very name stitched onto the donor plaque bolted to the hospital's front entrance. The family whose private empire could have single-handedly funded Grace Community's entire annual budget without noticing the expense. She looked at the man she had emptied her savings for, sold her father's ring for, defended in front of the hospital administrator for, and understood, with a physical pain that dropped straight to her stomach, that every single tear he had let fall in front of her had belonged to a man who could have paid for his own surgery 1,000 times over without blinking. "Zuriel, please let me explain," Kamsi said, pushing himself up from the bed with a strength his spinal injury should never have allowed, the lie collapsing in real time in front of the entire ward. She backed away from him as though the floor between them had become dangerous. "Explain what, exactly?" she said, her voice shaking with a fury that had nowhere honest to land. "That you watched me sell my father's ring while you own an empire that could buy this entire hospital? That you let me fight Mr. Bassi to keep you off the discharge list while private investigators were searching the country for a billionaire who was hiding inside a charity ward for fun?" Uzo Amako, standing nearby, could not entirely hide the flicker of triumph on her face. The truth had come out exactly as she'd suspected, and it had cost Zuriel everything while leaving Uzo's own hands perfectly clean. Dr. Chikobara stepped closer to Zuriel, positioning himself protectively, though he said nothing yet, sensing the moment did not belong to him. Kamsi reached for Zuriel's hand one last time, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she pulled hers away. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if this story has you feeling something right now, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Chapter 3 is about to break your heart even further. The news of Kamsiyochukwu Duru's disappearance and sudden reappearance spread through Grace Community Hospital, and eventually through the local press, within 48 hours. Chief Arins Duru arrived at the charity ward personally the following morning, dressed in a tailored agbada that seemed to belong to an entirely different universe than the peeling paint and squeaking wheelchairs surrounding him, flanked by 2 assistants and a private physician he had flown in against his son's protests. 6 weeks, Chief Arins said, his voice low with barely restrained anger as he stood over his son's hospital bed. 6 weeks you let me believe you might be dead in a ditch somewhere, while you played games pretending to be a cripple in a charity ward, for what? To prove some foolish theory about love. Kamsi did not flinch. "I found something here I never found in Lagos, father. I found someone who fought for me when she believed I had absolutely nothing to offer her." Chief Arin's eyes flicked toward the ward doorway, where Zuriel stood quietly finishing her shift notes, deliberately not looking in their direction. "A nurse," he said flatly, as though the word itself explained everything he needed to know. "Kamsi, we will discuss this properly once you are home, where you belong." Zuriel avoided the ward entirely for the next 3 days, requesting a transfer to the night shift so their paths would not cross, though she could not avoid the whispers that followed her through every corridor of the hospital. Some staff treated her like a fool who had been dramatically outplayed. Others treated her like a woman who had struck gold and simply hadn't realized it yet. Neither version of the story felt true to what she actually carried inside her, not humiliation over money, but grief over a trust she had given freely and completely, only to learn it had been built on a foundation that was never real. "You could have told me," she said finally, when Kamsi found her alone in the supply closet where she had gone specifically to avoid being found. "Not on day 1. I would have understood needing time. But you let me sell my father's ring, Kamsi. You let me believe you were dying without surgery you never needed, while I skipped meals so my mother could keep her dialysis appointments. Her voice broke on the last sentence, the first crack in the composure she had maintained since the truth came out. I wasn't testing you for entertainment, he said quietly. I was testing a whole world that has never once been kind to me without wanting something back. You were the only person in 6 weeks who never asked me for anything at all, and I destroyed the one true thing I found by lying about everything else. Uzoamako wasted no time capitalizing on the chaos, presenting herself to Kamsi as understanding, uncomplicated, and entirely uninterested in guilt-tripping him about his deception. Some of us actually understand men in your position, she told him during a visit she had not been assigned to make. Zuriel comes from problems. A sick mother, endless debts, a dead father's ring she'll probably regret selling for the rest of her life. You don't need that kind of heaviness in your life, Kamsi. You need someone who can simply enjoy what you've built without turning it into a moral lesson. Kamsi studied her with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with his fabricated injury, and everything to do with recognizing, once again, the exact hunger he had spent 6 weeks trying to escape. That heaviness, he said slowly, is the realest thing that has happened to me in years. I would take Zuriel's version of love, ring and all, over anything you're offering me right now. Uzoamako's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes hardened into resolve. If she could not win him honestly, she would find another way to make herself useful to whoever controlled the outcome, and Chief Arins, she suspected, would soon be looking for exactly that kind of ally. Dr. Chikobara found Zuriel on the hospital rooftop that evening, staring out over Lagos traffic with her arms wrapped around herself against the wind. I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry he's gone from the ward, Chike admitted, standing beside her at a respectful distance. I watched you give that man everything you had, Zuriel, while I stood by wishing you'd let someone actually capable of matching what you give get close to you instead. She let out a broken laugh that carried no real humor in it. Is this really the moment, Chike? No, he said honestly. But grief doesn't wait for convenient timing, and neither does the truth. I've admired you since your first week here, not because of what you can give me, but because of how much you refuse to stop giving, even when it costs you everything, including your father's ring. For a moment, something in her softened toward him, exhausted and raw and genuinely moved by a kindness that asked for nothing complicated in return. She did not answer him that night, but she did not walk away either, and somewhere in that unclaimed silence, a quieter chapter of her heart began, cautiously, to consider a version of love that came without empires attached to it. Kamsi returned to the Duru mansion that weekend to find his father already deep into arrangements that had nothing to do with reconciliation and everything to do with damage control. Chief Okonkwo's daughter, Beatrice, has agreed to the engagement announcement, his father said, sliding a folder across the dining table as though it were a business report rather than his son's entire future. The merger between our hospital chains has been stalled for 2 years over trust issues, Kamsi. This marriage fixes that permanently, and it fixes the embarrassment of your little disappearing act in one announcement. Kamsi stared at the folder without opening it. I'm in love with someone else, father. You were infatuated with a fantasy for 6 weeks, Chief Arins said coldly. The engagement announcement goes out this Friday, whether you attend the dinner or not. I have spent 30 years building this family's name, and I will not watch a village nurse unravel it because you wanted to feel like a poor man for a summer. Kamsi left the mansion that night without eating, driving nowhere in particular for hours, replaying every moment Zuriel had defended him to a hospital administrator, sold her inheritance for a stranger, and pulled her hand away from his the instant she learned the truth. And somewhere on that long, aimless drive, he made a decision his father would not be able to control. If you're still with us and this story is stirring something in you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. It means more to us than you know. Chapter 4 is where the real fight begins. Kamsi arrived back at Grace Community Hospital 8 days later, not in a wheelchair this time, but in a simple white shirt with no entourage, no cameras, and no assistants trailing behind him, having personally driven himself for the first time in years. He found Zuriel in the medication room, and she stiffened the moment she saw him, her hand tightening around the tray she was carrying. "I'm not here to apologize again with words," he said before she could ask him to leave. "I already know words don't fix what I broke. I'm here because I paid off every outstanding debt at your mother's dialysis center this morning, anonymously, before I even considered coming to find you, because I needed you to know that whatever happens between us, her treatment is no longer something you have to carry alone. That decision has nothing to do with winning you back. It has everything to do with the fact that you should never have had to sell your father's ring in the first place, and I refuse to let that debt exist for one more day, regardless of how you feel about me." Zuriel set the tray down slowly, her composure cracking at the edges. "You don't get to fix things with money, Kamsi, after everything you taught me about how much that hurts." "I know," he said quietly. "That's exactly why I'm still standing here, even though I know it isn't enough." News of Kamsi's engagement announcement to Beatrice Okonkwo broke publicly that same week, splashed across society pages under headlines celebrating the merger of two great hospital dynasties. Zuriel read the announcement on her phone during her lunch break, and something in her chest went strangely, unexpectedly numb rather than furious, as though she had already braced herself for exactly this outcome the moment she learned his real name. When Kamsi returned to the hospital 2 days later, she showed him the article before he could explain himself. "Your father moves fast," she said flatly. "My father moves fast because he's terrified," Kamsi replied. "He knows that for the first time in my life, I am prepared to walk away from everything he's built rather than marry a stranger to save a business deal. The engagement announcement went out without my consent, Zuriel. I have not signed anything, and I do not intend to." She wanted desperately to believe him, and hated herself a little for how badly she wanted it, given everything the last few weeks had already cost her. "You keep telling me what you refuse to do," she said. "I need to see what you're actually willing to do instead, Kamsi, because I already gave everything I had to a man who turned out to be someone else entirely, and I cannot survive doing that twice." Uzo Amako, sensing an opportunity in the widening gap between Kamsi and Zuriel, quietly reached out to Chief Arins through one of his assistants, offering information about the ongoing visits to the hospital in exchange for a modest introduction to the family's business circle, a transaction she told herself was simply being practical, the very phrase she had once used to judge Zuriel for caring too much. Chief Arins, delighted to have eyes inside the hospital, began using Uzo Amako's reports to time his own interventions with surgical precision, appearing at the hospital whenever Kamsi's visits threatened to grow too serious. Meanwhile, Dr. Chikobara, watching Kamsi's persistent return visits with a jealousy he tried and failed to fully suppress, finally worked up the courage to speak plainly to Zuriel during a quiet moment in the staff lounge. "I know this isn't the ideal time," Chike said, "but I don't think there will ever be an ideal time, so I'm simply going to say it. I would like the chance to take you out properly, Zuriel, not as your colleague, but as a man who has watched you give everything to people who rarely deserve it, and who would like the opportunity to give some of it back to you instead." Zuriel, exhausted and genuinely moved, found herself agreeing to dinner that Friday, less out of certainty about her feelings for Chike and more out of a desperate need to feel like her heart belonged to someone uncomplicated for even one evening. Kamsi arrived at the hospital that same Friday evening with a small, deliberately unglamorous gift in hand, a plain gold band, nowhere near as expensive as anything his family name could easily afford, chosen specifically because it resembled, in spirit if not in exact design, the ring her father had once given her. He found the ward staff room empty except for a note pinned to Zuriel's locker, "Gone for the evening, personal plans." When he asked a passing nurse where she had gone, the answer landed like a blow he had not braced for. Dinner, with Dr. Obara, her first real evening off in months. Kamsi stood in the empty corridor for a long moment, the small ring box still closed in his palm, forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that trust, once broken, does not simply wait patiently on a shelf for the person who broke it to feel ready to repair it. He left the ring with the head nurse, along with a note that said only, "This isn't to buy anything back. It's to remind you that somewhere out there, a poor man in a wheelchair once told you the truest thing he'd ever said to anyone, that you were the only person who ever made him feel like more than his money. That was never a lie, even when everything else was." Then he walked out into the Lagos night, uncertain for the first time in his adult life whether wanting someone badly enough would ever be sufficient to earn them back. Chief Arins, informed by Uzo that his son had visited the hospital again against explicit instructions, decided the time for patience had ended. He arrived at Zuriel's modest apartment complex the following morning, uninvited, while her mother rested in the next room connected to a home dialysis unit Kamsi had quietly arranged to have installed. "I will make this simple," Chief Arins said, standing in her doorway with the practiced calm of a man accustomed to negotiating multi-million naira contracts. "Stay away from my son permanently, and I will personally ensure your mother's medical care is covered for the rest of her life, along with a generous settlement for you and your family. Continue seeing him, and I promise you, I have both the resources and the patience to make your life considerably more difficult than it already is." Zuriel stood very still, absorbing the threat disguised as an offer, thinking of every double shift, every skipped meal, every moment she had sold a piece of her father's memory to survive, and found, to her own surprise, that the fear she expected to feel had curdled instead into something closer to anger. "Chief Duru," she said evenly, "your son already offered me money to disappear once, indirectly, when he lied about who he was for 6 weeks. I refused it then, and I'm refusing whatever version of it you're offering now. My mother's care is not for sale, and neither am I." If Zuriel's strength is inspiring you right now, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. We read every single one of them. Chapter 5 is where everything comes to a head. Chief Arins left Zuriel's apartment that morning with his expression unreadable, but the men he summoned to his private office that same afternoon received instructions far more direct than the offer he had extended to her face. "I want the mother's health situation to become complicated enough that the daughter no longer has time to think about my son," he told his head of security, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades avoiding direct fingerprints on anything unpleasant. "Nothing permanent. Nothing that draws attention. Simply enough disruption that priorities shift back to where they belong." He told himself, as he had told himself many times before regarding many other obstacles, that this was simply the cost of protecting 30 years of legacy from a nurse's stubbornness and his son's misplaced idealism. What he did not anticipate was how quickly, and how badly, his instructions would be carried out by men more interested in a quick payout than in subtlety, nor did he anticipate that his own son, informed by a guilty and increasingly conflicted Uzo about the conversation she had overheard, would arrive at the truth almost as fast as the danger itself. 2 nights later, the home dialysis unit at Zuriel's apartment malfunctioned in a way the technician later confirmed had clearly been tampered with, cutting power at a critical point in her mother's treatment cycle. Zuriel found her mother unconscious on the living room floor when she returned from her shift, and the scream that tore out of her that night was one the neighbors would describe, weeks later, as the most frightening sound they had ever heard from that apartment. She called an ambulance with trembling hands, riding beside her mother's stretcher the entire way to Grace Community, praying in a language that mixed English and Igbo and pure, wordless panic, bargaining with God for a life that had already given her so little room to bargain with anything. By the time they reached the emergency room, her mother's pulse was dangerously faint, and the attending physician's face carried the particular grimness of someone unsure whether the next hour would end in relief or grief. Zuriel sat in the corridor outside the emergency bay, still in yesterday's scrubs, gripping her phone with a single message typed and deleted 4 times before she finally sent it to the one person whose resources might actually change the outcome. My mother is dying. I need help. Please. Kamsi arrived at the hospital in under 20 minutes, breaking every traffic law Lagos had ever written, and did not stop moving from the moment he entered the emergency department, calling in the top nephrology specialist from his family's private hospital chain, personally authorizing the transfer of a state-of-the-art dialysis machine that would not otherwise have reached Grace Community's charity ward for another 2 years, and standing beside Zuriel in the corridor without once mentioning his father's name, though the guilt of what he now understood his family had likely caused sat visibly on his face like a physical weight. I don't know for certain that this was my father, he said quietly, but I know enough about how he operates to be almost certain, and I am done protecting him from the consequences of that certainty. Zuriel, too exhausted and terrified to process the full weight of what he was confessing, simply gripped his hand the way she once had in Ward 4, before any of the lies, before any of the money, back when he was simply a frightened man and she was simply a nurse who refused to let anyone die feeling forgotten. Whatever happens with your father, she said, her voice raw, please just help her survive tonight. That's all I'm asking of you right now. The specialist worked through the night, and by dawn, Zuriel's mother's condition had stabilized enough for the doctors to speak, cautiously, about recovery rather than crisis. Kamsi left the hospital only long enough to confront his father directly, arriving at the Duru mansion still in the same clothes he had worn all night, his composure finally, completely gone. You had her mother's dialysis machine sabotaged, Kamsi said, his voice shaking with a fury he had never once directed at his father in his entire life. A woman nearly died last night, father, because you decided a nurse's stubbornness was a threat worth eliminating instead of simply respecting my right to choose who I love. Chief Arins did not deny it outright, which was, in its own way, confession enough. I protect what I've built, Kamsi. I have always protected what I've built. Then understand this clearly, Kamsi said. I am done being part of what you're building, if this is the price of it. I will not marry Beatrice Okonkwo. I will not continue pretending your methods are acceptable simply because they're wrapped in expensive suits and quiet phone calls. If you come near Zuriel or her mother again, I will personally ensure every newspaper in this country knows exactly how the Duru name protects its legacy. For the first time in Kamsi's memory, his father said nothing at all in response. Word of the confrontation reached Beatrice Okonkwo's family before the afternoon ended, and Chief Okonkwo, unwilling to have his daughter's name attached to a scandal involving sabotaged medical equipment, withdrew from the merger agreement entirely within hours, ending both the engagement and the business deal his father had sacrificed so much to protect. Uzo Amako, watching the entire empire of arrangements collapse around her, understood that whatever advantage she had hoped to gain by feeding information to Chief Arins had evaporated along with his usefulness, and quietly began looking for a transfer to another hospital before her role in the affair became public knowledge among her colleagues. Dr. Chikobara, meanwhile, watching Kamsi's unwavering presence at Zuriel's side through the entire crisis, recognized with a quiet, mature grace that the dinner they had shared, however genuine, had been a moment of comfort rather than the beginning of something lasting, and he stepped back from pursuing her further without bitterness, choosing instead to remain simply, steadily, a good colleague and a good friend. Zuriel's mother made a full recovery over the following 2 weeks, and with each passing day, Zuriel watched Kamsi show up not as a billionaire making grand gestures for an audience, but as a man quietly present in the smallest, least glamorous ways, sitting with her mother during long dialysis sessions, learning to prepare the bland soup her mother's restricted diet required, sitting outside the ward at 2 a.m. simply so Zuriel would not have to walk to her car alone after a night shift. There were no more surprises about his identity to uncover, no more lies waiting beneath the surface, only the slow, deliberate work of a man proving through consistency what he had failed to prove through disguise. One evening, as they sat together on the same rooftop where she had once stood with Chike processing her grief, Kamsi finally spoke the words he had been circling for weeks. I went looking for someone who would love me without my money, Zuriel, and I found something far better than what I was looking for. I found a woman who loved me enough to fight for a stranger, sacrifice her inheritance for a lie, and then still show me grace when the truth cost her almost everything. I am not asking you to forget what I did. I am asking you to let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me anyway." He reached into his pocket and produced not a new, extravagant ring, but the very same plain gold band he had left with the head nurse weeks earlier, the one she had never picked up, though she had also, notably, never asked anyone to send it back to him. "I know it isn't your father's ring," Kamsi said quietly. "Nothing could ever replace that, and I would never try. But I would be honored if you'd let this ring mean something new, not the end of what you sacrificed, but the beginning of everything I intend to spend my life making sure you never have to sacrifice again." Zuriel looked at the ring, then at him, then allowed herself, finally, to cry the tears she had been holding back since the night the truth first came out in Ward 4, not tears of grief this time, but the release of weeks spent guarding a heart she had been terrified to fully open again. "You lied to me for 6 weeks, she said, half laughing through the tears. "You did," he agreed. "And I have spent every day since trying to become a man honest enough to deserve a second chance at telling you the truth." She took the ring, sliding it onto her finger herself before he could, and the smile that broke across his face in that moment was the first one Zuriel had ever seen from him that carried absolutely no calculation behind it at all. The wedding took place 3 months later at Grace Community Hospital itself, a decision Zuriel insisted on despite Kamsi's family's initial objections, held in the very courtyard where indigent patients often waited for hours to be seen. Chief Arins, humbled by the near loss of both his son and his family's reputation, attended quietly and without protest, standing beside a wife who had privately told him, weeks earlier, that she would not forgive him easily for what his ambition had nearly cost. Dr. Chaikobara attended as well, seated among the hospital staff, applauding genuinely when the couple exchanged vows, having long since made peace with the outcome and found, in the months that followed, a quieter happiness of his own with a colleague from the pediatric ward. Uzo Amako did not attend, having transferred to a hospital in Port Harcourt weeks earlier, though word eventually reached Zuriel that she had grown more reflective about the choices that had once cost her a friendship and, briefly, her integrity. Zuriel walked down the courtyard in a simple white dress, her mother, healthy, walking unassisted for the first time in over a year, standing proudly beside her, and as Kamsi watched her approach, he thought of the 6 weeks he had spent in a wheelchair he did not need, and understood that every lie he had told had somehow, impossibly, led him to the one truth that mattered. 6 months into their marriage, Kamsi redirected a significant portion of the Duru Group's charitable foundation toward a permanent, fully funded wing at Grace Community Hospital, designed specifically to provide free treatment, medication, and long-term care to indigent patients who could never otherwise afford it, the exact category of patient the hospital had once nearly discharged him from, believing he had nothing to offer in return. He named the wing not after himself, but after her, the Amati Wing for Compassionate Care, a name Zuriel initially protested until he reminded her, gently, that her name belonged on it more than his ever could, since it was her compassion, not his money, that had built the foundation for everything that followed. At the dedication ceremony, standing before hospital staff, former patients, and local press, Zuriel spoke briefly about what it meant to care for someone without knowing what they could give you in return, and about how the truest form of love, and the truest form of medicine, both begin with treating a person like they matter before you know a single thing about their bank account. Kamsi stood at her side throughout, no longer hiding behind a wheelchair or a false name, simply a husband, quietly proud, watching the woman who had once sold her father's ring for a stranger now stand as the namesake of a hospital wing that would care for thousands of strangers in the years to come. That night, walking together through the newly opened wing after the guests had gone home, Kamsi finally told her the full truth about the moment his heart had changed forever. Not the night she sold the ring, though that had broken something open in him too, but the very first night in Ward 4, when he had overheard her quietly telling a frightened, terminally ill patient in the next bed that no one, under her care, would ever die feeling forgotten. I built my entire life around the belief that people only valued what I could give them, he said, his hand intertwined with hers as they walked past the very bed where their story had begun. You were the first person who showed me that some people simply value people, full stop, and once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it, no matter how badly it complicated my plans to protect myself. Zuriel leaned her head against his shoulder, thinking of every double shift, every sacrifice, every moment she had nearly given up on believing love could exist without a hidden cost attached to it. I didn't fall in love with a billionaire, Kamsi, she said softly. I fell in love with a man in a wheelchair who thanked me like my kindness actually mattered to him. Everything after that was just the world finally catching up to what I already knew was true. Outside, Lagos glittered under the night sky, indifferent to fortunes made and lost, but inside the Amadi wing, something far more valuable than money had finally, quietly, come home to stay. That's the story tonight. If it moved you even a little, please like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and comment where you're watching from. We read every comment and we're always grateful you chose to spend this time with us. See you in the next story.